Good day, welcome. I'm Amy Sutherland, Assistant Director at the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh. My honor to welcome you to the second session of the virtual Conversations on Canada Spring 2023 series. Conversations on Canada webinar series is organized by the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York at Plattsburgh. Center and Institute is a United States Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center on Canada, with additional support from the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. Thank you to our supporters. The series, Conversations on Canada, addresses current issues central to a fuller understanding of Canadian society. We have a variety of past sessions available on our YouTube channel, Conversations on Canada. So please do check out that YouTube Conversations on Canada channel and check out our past sessions. Thank you to all our members of the virtual audience joining us today. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Kirkley, Director of the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh.
Appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. Bonjour à tous. We are delighted to have my longstanding friend and colleague, Dr. Frederick Gagnon from the University of Quebec à Montréal, with us today. As you've seen from the promotional materials that we have sent out, Frederick is the Raoul Dandurand Chair in Strategic and Diplomatic Studies, and he's Director of the Center for United States Studies, and not to be outdone, the Center for Multidimensional Conflicts at the University of Quebec at Montreal, amongst other hats that he wears. He's a wonderful scholar, terrific ambassador for the University of Quebec at Montreal, and does very meaningful research and scholarship, a lot of hands-on stuff which allows not just people in Quebec and in Canada, but internationally to understand more broadly what's going on in American politics. He's written books and chapters, many of which have covered Donald Trump's foreign policy, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the American Congress, the impact of 9/11 on international relations, and even Hollywood movies and national security issues in the United States. So Dr. Gagnon Frederick has published far and wide. We've had the good fortune some years back in 2014 to have Frederick here as our distinguished Quebec scholar in residence through the Fulbright program, at which time some of the research that he may speak to today, he would mention that that sort of initial burst began, at least in terms of on the ground doing interviews and stuff, while he was here at Plattsburgh. And we've maintained a wonderful working relationship over the years between his center, our Institute of Quebec Studies, the two universities. We've, as I've suggested, we've worked together on various projects such as co-edited scholarly journals. We've worked together on pulling scholars together from across Canada, the United States, for colloquy and authors workshops. And we're currently with our colleague Stéphane Paquin at École Nationale d'Administration Publique, ENAP. We're working on a book, the first book, an overdue book on the U.S.-Quebec relationship. So I want to encourage you, as Amy has, if you have questions for Frederick, to please put them in the chat. I believe that's correct. And after Frederick's done speaking, I'll moderate a question and answer period with Frederick based on whatever inquiries you may have. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Frederick, who today will be speaking to us on Canada-U.S. relations in an era of deglobalization and great power competition. Fred, please.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me? You can, right? Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back at SUNY Plattsburgh. I also want to thank Fulbright Canada for the opportunity to give a few talks on SUNY's campus this week. And I'll be happy to talk about Canada-U.S. relations, especially today, a week after Joe Biden's visit to Canada. I think it's a good timing, Chris, to talk about the meeting between Biden and Trudeau and what it means for the years to come. So Biden was in Ottawa last Thursday and Friday for his first official visit to Canada since December 2016, when he was Barack Obama's vice president. And I think this visit was a reminder of how much Justin Trudeau's life has changed since the 2020 U.S. presidential election. If you followed Biden and Trudeau as I was last week, you were probably wondering what Canada-U.S. relations would look like if Donald Trump had been elected to a second term. I think we can agree that it would not have made such a cordial visit to Ottawa. Actually, he did not come to Canada's capital during his presidency. And if you remember, he even left the 2018 G7 summit in Charlevoix before the end of the proceedings, expressing frustration with Canadian tariffs on American dairy exports. And if Trump were president right now, I think it might have been more difficult for Trudeau to negotiate a deal to close Roxham Road. We know it's a very important issue here in the area of Plattsburgh. Trump would probably still be attacking Trudeau personally or Canada's unfair trade practices on social media and in public. Actually, I don't know if you saw this last weekend, but there was a campaign rally in Waco, Texas. So Trump was there, and he talked about the Biden-Trudeau meeting, saying that the deals between Biden and Trudeau are horrible deals, just to quote Trump, and that Canada is treating Americans horribly on trade. So the same kind of story as before. So Biden's visit to Ottawa last week reminded everyone that one of the highlights of Canada-U.S. relations these days is probably the return to calm after the Trump storm. But Biden's election in 2020 has not resolved all the issues that marked the Trump presidency. And what I want to argue today is that Canada-U.S. relations are currently driven by at least two major trends, one of which continues to create uncertainties similar to those that marked the Trump years, and the other of which favors the return of stronger collaboration between Washington and Ottawa. So the first trend that I'll be talking about today is what I call the growing U.S. appetite for deglobalization that I think is evident since at least the 2016 election in the U.S. It's an appetite that's not going away. I think it's still there, and I think that it still guides many policies, many of Biden's policies towards Canada. The second trend that I want to talk about today is the rise of great power rivalries with Russia and China. While the U.S. appetite for deglobalization creates various frictions between Canada and the U.S., I will argue that the rise of great power rivalry with Russia and China, has the opposite effect, prompting Biden to look more to its key allies, including Canada, to counterbalance U.S. major rivals. And as I will say in my conclusion, it's difficult to know which trend will prevail over the other over the next few years. But the meeting between Trudeau and Biden last week certainly showed that Biden sees Canada as more of an asset than was the case with Trump. So Biden wants to collaborate with Canada. But he's also concerned about Trump's potential comeback in 2024. And he became president at a time in history when Americans' appetite for deglobalization is pretty high. So I want to say a few words about this first trend. And I want to build on Norrin Ripsman's work to define this appetite for deglobalization. I will define it as a desire for, and I'm going to quote Ripsman's work here, a reduction of global exchange and a reassertion of national control over commerce, politics, and social affairs. I think this mood has become increasingly popular in the U.S. marketplace of ideas in recent years, particularly since the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, a sign of the excesses of banks and capitalist elites in the eyes of several political actors like Senator Bernie Sanders. I know you remember that. The Great Recession of 08-09 has also led to a greater questioning of the virtues of economic globalization or the benefits of trade agreements for American jobs. So Donald Trump held relatively similar views, during the 2016 presidential primaries. Senator Sanders and Republican candidate Donald Trump held relatively similar views about the need to renegotiate NAFTA. You remember that? Trump renegotiated NAFTA with Mexico and Canada during his presidency. Trump also said that he wanted to reject the Trans-Pacific Partnership, fight for fight the loss of manufacturing jobs in regions like the Midwest and so on. Thanks to his victory over Clinton in the 2016 election, Trump was thus able to use the presidential megaphone to hammer home such ideas for 4 years. You remember his vision of international trade. His vision was that, let's say, international economic and trade relations are often a zero-sum game, making winners and losers. So you remember that he talked a lot about job losses, about trade deficits. He also said or argued that the future of the United States depends largely on its economic power in an international system where other states are overtaking it, mainly China. I'll come back to China later. Third, he said, or he seemed to think that the role of the president of the United States is to rectify the situation by all means. So he used tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, for instance. He rejected trade agreements and so on to make sure that the United States would be more competitive in the future. And he also seemed to think that, as in business, there are no friends in international economic relations. Therefore, traditional allies can hurt the United States as much as competitors. That's what Trump used to seem to international economic relations. So during his 4 years in the White House, Trump used tough words to describe Canada, as you remember, claiming, among other things, that the U.S. has been the victim of decades of abuse and unfair trade practices by its northern neighbor. He also used economic measures against Canada, which Justin Trudeau called insulting at times, notably the tariffs that the White House imposed on Canadian steel and aluminum. And in field investigations I conducted in 9 states neighboring Canada during the 2018 midterm elections, Chris said that I started to do that research while I was here in Plattsburgh in 2014. So I've been doing similar research during various electoral cycles in 2018, for instance. So what I did is I performed interviews with dozens of local political actors, including members and candidates from both parties in many states that share a border with Canada. So Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And this research was really fascinating because it allowed me to document the rise in popularity of Trump's skepticism towards Canada, but also this growing appetite for deglobalization I'm talking about today. If you want more information about this research project, you can check out my 2019 article on this topic that was published in the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal. What I argue in the article is that Trump has succeeded in placing Canada and key Canada-U.S. issues at the forefront of various political and electoral discussions in these states, but he has also been able to convince many local actors in these states to follow his agenda, to adopt his attitude towards Canada. And these are local actors that had a more positive view of Canada before the 2016 election. So we clearly see a Trump effect here. At least that's what we argue in the research. And when I conducted a new round of field research in the Midwest during the 2022 midterm elections, I found that these themes have not disappeared, and they remain particularly popular in 3 states that played a key role in Trump's 2016 election. We all know these states. They were very important: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And we all remember that Biden had to adopt, at times, a protectionist rhetoric very similar to Trump's to take back those states and win the 2020 presidential election. Biden's State of the Union address last February shows that he seems convinced that another victory in 2024 will also require continuing in this direction and echoing the appetite for deglobalization that I'm talking about today. So I don't know if you watched the State of the Union address, but there's a part of the State of the Union address, at least one part, that is very reminiscent of Trump's views of international trade, relationships with other states when it comes to globalization. Biden, in this State of the Union address, said, and I'm going to quote him, "Too many good-paying manufacturing jobs moved overseas, factories at home closed down, once thriving cities and towns became shadows of what they used to be," unquote. So, of course, we saw that last week. Biden is more discriminating than Trump between economic rivals and traditional allies like Canada. And he does not use the same methods to promote jobs in the United States. For instance, Biden was against Trump's tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. But last week, during Biden's visit to Canada, no fireside chat at the Trudeau residence or curling sessions for Jill Biden could have convinced the White House to make major trade concessions in public to its northern neighbor in areas and regions critical to winning key presidential states in 2024. So while the meeting between Biden and Trudeau brought a lot of optimism to Canadians, there are still many economic and trade frictions between the two countries, and that will likely remain in the years to come. So I think Canadians will have to get used to seeing Biden and his party listening to very important blocks to win in 2024. Wisconsin dairy farmers who don't like Canada's supply management system. Voters in Michigan would like cars assembled in North America to contain more US-made parts. Unions in states like Pennsylvania want Biden to rely on various measures to make sure that his green revolution and infrastructure projects are made in America. But Biden's visit to Ottawa last week also showed that Trudeau can get around some of this protectionism if he demonstrates that Canada is essential to Biden's key foreign policy objectives. So last week on foreign policy, I think you saw the meeting, Trudeau answered Biden's call for Canada to play a greater role in stabilizing Haiti, trade NORAD equipment, to increase defense investments, to contribute more to NATO operations. But as one can see from the joint statement by Biden and Trudeau that was released at the end of Biden's visit, the main foreign policy obsession of the White House seems to be great power competition and US rivalry with China and Russia. And I think that this is the second major trend that will be guiding Canada-U.S. relations in the years to come. On Russia, Biden and Trudeau condemn Moscow's, quote, illegal, unjustifiable, and unprovoked war against Ukraine. They also announced that Washington and Ottawa will, quote, as long as they that seemed to guide much of the direction taken by Biden and Trudeau last week. Although they did not often mention China directly in their speeches to Parliament, though Biden made a mistake at some point and said China instead of Canada. Trudeau and Biden didn't mention China very, very often in their speeches and in their final press conference. But if you look at the joint statement, you see that Trudeau and Biden express serious concerns about Beijing's policies. As the statement says, quote, Canada and the United States acknowledge the serious long-term challenge to the international order posed by the People's Republic of China. They will remain committed to ensuring their ability to compete effectively with China. Biden's desire to rival China and to reduce US dependence on East Asia is particularly evident in two areas, critical minerals and semiconductors. As we know, critical minerals are crucial to Biden's green revolution because minerals such as lithium, nickel, cobalt, and copper, and others are essential to develop clean energy technologies such as car batteries and wind turbines. I don't know if you saw that, but last November, CBC News journalist Alex Panetta published a really interesting report about what Washington thinks about critical minerals right now. It reported, quote, that the United States military has been quietly soliciting applications for Canadian mining projects that want American public funding through a major national security initiative, unquote. As Panetta explains, critical minerals, this initiative is an increasingly urgent priority of the US government because, quote, lessening dependence on China for critical minerals that are vital in everything from civilian goods such as electronics, cars, and batteries, but also weapons, is extremely important for Biden, for this administration, and for this government. The security of semiconductor supplies is also critical to Biden, and probably the best book to understand why is Chip War by Chris Miller. I don't know if you've read the book, it's very interesting. Chris Miller is an assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. If you read the book, you see that Miller explains that during the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain disruptions made people realize how much their lives depend on semiconductors. It's very fascinating. The chips and microchips that we all know, that Miller talks about in the book, are found in just about every product today. Your cell phone, your computer, your car, your PlayStation 5, if you have one, your fridge, and weapon systems also. And there's a map in the book that's very interesting that says that East Asia produces, quote, 90% of all memory chips. And Taiwan in particular is a very important player in that area. Miller tells us in the book, the map is very interesting. You can look at it, that Taiwan produces more than 90% of the most advanced chips. And of course, Taiwan's security is constantly threatened by China. So the Biden administration is pretty nervous about this situation. Miller writes that it is so concerned about the potential for chip shortages and US dependence on Taiwan and East Asia in this sector that the White House commissioned a 250-page report on supply chain vulnerabilities, focusing in great part on semiconductors. So I looked at the report. You can look at it. It's online. It was released in June 2021. And it states, quote, that the United States is dangerously dependent on specific countries in these areas, especially Taiwan, for the reasons I just mentioned. And the report also talks about China because it says that the US is too dependent on China for, quote, global cell fabrication for advanced batteries, but also critical minerals. The report also states that Washington must, quote, secure reliable and sustainable supplies to ensure resilience across US manufacturing and defense needs. On page, I think it's page 163, there's a map of Canada in the report, where the report tells you that there's a lot of potential north of the US border with all these locations of critical minerals that you see in Canada, in the province of Quebec, and so on. So it is in this context that Biden and Trudeau met last week, and their commitment to work better together to bring critical minerals and semiconductor supply chains back to North America shows that Biden is willing and will be willing to put aside his protectionism towards Canada if working with Ottawa can help the US better compete with China in these sectors. So last week, Biden and Trudeau announced several initiatives that I think illustrate the point that I made in my introduction, which is that the great power rivalry between the US and China is leading to stronger ties between Canada and the United States, even if the appetite for deglobalization is still strong on your side of the border here in the United States. It's certainly no coincidence that Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy released in February places great emphasis on these supply chains and echoes almost verbatim the vision of China outlined in Biden's U.S. national security strategy released in October 22. Actually, Canada's strategy goes even further than Biden's national security strategy, calling China a disruptive power, as if Ottawa wanted to make it as clear as possible to Biden that Canada has finally chosen sides in this rivalry. Trudeau and Biden announced many things last week related to these supply chains. They announced that they will, quote, work together to create a strong and resilient North American critical minerals supply chain, that they're also committed, quote, to identifying, securing, and developing critical minerals extraction, processing, manufacturing, and recycling opportunities in both countries to diversify supply chains essential to clean energy, electric vehicles, semiconductors, aerospace, and defense. There were also other announcements, notably about Canada and IBM providing a significant investment, quote, to develop new and expanded packaging and testing capabilities at the IBM Promont facility in Quebec. So many things like that related to critical minerals or semiconductors. So in conclusion, my goal today was to illustrate that two major trends will guide and seem to guide Canada-U.S. relations right now. On one hand, as I said in the first part of my presentation, the appetite for deglobalization in the U.S. is driving key constituencies to demand that Biden creates jobs on American soil first, even if it hurts Canada sometimes. But on the other hand, U.S. rivalry with Russia and China is driving Biden to work closely with Canada on common defense, but also supply chain management. I think it's difficult to know which of these trends will prevail in the medium and long term. It will depend on many factors. I think they can coexist for a while also. I think that among the factors that will be interesting to watch in the years to come is first of all, if there's a recession in the United States. The state of the economy in the US will be a key factor to follow, I think, if you want to know, for instance, if there is a further appetite on this side of the border for deglobalization. Another factor to watch will, of course, be the outcome of the presidential election in 2024. Several questions will be of great interest to Canadians in the coming months. Will Biden run for a second term? If so, will he win the election? Will it be possible to continue the Biden-Trudeau agenda beyond January 2025? And on the Republican side, will Donald Trump win his party's nomination? Will he take back the White House in January 2025? Sorry about that. And if Trump comes back to office, Ottawa can already expect him to return to the vision for Canada-U.S. relations that he put forward during his first term. I think we can bet on this. So last week when Biden and Trudeau met, Trudeau was probably thinking about Trump a little bit and hoping for the best, Chris. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much. Thanks for your attention. And I'll be glad to answer a few questions if you have questions.
Thanks, Frederick, very, very much. We greatly appreciate your remarks today, and it certainly has led to some observations and questions from people. I'll start off with an observation and a question built into that I think stems directly from your presentation, and that is that the inference of your analysis is that, okay, the international political system, we end the Cold War in 1991, the Soviet Union politically dissolves, Christmas of 91, we're left with one great power at the time, the United States, and it seems that since 1991, over the last 32 years or so, power shifting, right? And we see arguably China's on the rise, and certainly Russia under Putin has changed dramatically from what Russia initially was after the Cold War. And your suggestion is that, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that regardless of who's somewhat in power, and we'll come back to Trump in a second, in Washington and Ottawa, that there's certainly incentives for both capitals, whether in Ottawa it's the Liberals or Conservatives, and whether it's the Democrats or Republicans in Washington, D.C., but both sides seem to be reasonably incentivized to work together. There is sort of powers at work that are drawing them to cooperate with one another on a range of issues. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, I think so. I would agree with that. Actually, the debate on critical minerals was an important one when Trump was president also. So it's not Biden that brought this idea that we should friendshore or reshore supply chain, critical mineral supply chains here. Trump was really interested in that too. So yeah, and you can look at international relations theory, and some of them say that you don't really need to open the black box of states to understand how they behave in the world. And right now what's happening is that you have these powers, Russia and China, that are becoming more important in the world. And of course, I think it leads members of both parties, at least in Washington, to be very preoccupied with China. Of course, on Russia, they differ a lot. I think if Trump is elected, the U.S. foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine is gonna become very different. But I agree with you. I think that the rise of China is prompting, at least in Washington, both parties to say we have to be careful now. We have to be more careful. And in Canada, I would say that the Indo-Pacific strategy that I alluded to proves that Canada is adopting the same kind of policy right now on our side of the border when it comes to China, at least.
That's right. Going back to this issue, or following up rather, with regard to the possibility of Donald Trump not only winning the Republican nomination, but coming back for a second term as American president, we know, and you carefully remarked and accurately remarked on sort of Trump's position vis-a-vis Canada and Prime Minister Trudeau. Now, we don't know if Justin Trudeau will still be prime minister at the time, but if Trump were to hypothetically reemerge, if you will, and become president, given his position toward Canada, you know, on the one hand, I think you're right. I mean, he's going to be inclined to sort of look at Canada the same as always, sort of taking advantage of the United States on trade deals, not committing enough assistance to NATO and trying to meet the 2% of GDP, and sort of being a free rider when it comes to alliance military policy. But having said that, Trump, I'm wondering if you think, you know, will he be somewhat tempered by the need, given this China-Russia issue, to sort of say, you know, I can't get everybody angry at me. These are allies. I need to work with them, whether it's on critical resources or other issues. So, do you think that's going to be the case under Trump? Do you think he might be tempered a bit in terms of his approach to Ottawa, or will he just be the same old guy?
Excuse me, I think we had a problem with the connection, but I think I heard the question. You were asking if Trump would be different in a second term, right?
Okay. Yeah. I was going to say, essentially, is Trump going to be much different towards Canada?
Well, if you look at Trump's political career, you see that he hasn't changed very much since he entered the presidential race in 2015 and 16. And at the time, people were saying, you know, he's taking this approach because he wants to win the GOP nomination, and in primaries, you have to please your base. You have to talk to your base, and that's what Trump did during the GOP primaries in 2016. And I remember at the time, people were saying he's going to change, he's going to become more moderate, run in the center. Comes when during the presidential election in November. But Trump, as we say in French, a persisté et signé. He didn't change during the general campaign. He didn't change his way of doing things when he was in the White House. And again, last weekend in Waco, he talked about Biden and Trudeau and said that Canada is bad, it's horrible, the deals are bad, blah, blah, blah. So to me, it's the same kind of approach. So if Trump is reelected, will he be tempered by what's happening? Maybe a little bit, but he doesn't really change his approach. So maybe the change would be minor and no more. Right.
What do you think, Frederick?
Again, if I can add something.
Sure.
Even if Trump is reelected in 2024, it doesn't mean that it's the end of the world for Canada. Because when Trump was president, the Trudeau government was, I think, pretty good at managing the relationship with the U.S. and with this administration. The renegotiation of NAFTA was a tough period for Trudeau, for Chrystia Freeland, and so on. But they did a pretty good job because they invested the resources and the time in the relationship. The problem is that you have to put all your attention on the United States when it happens, and that's why Trudeau called his policy towards the United States, his foreign policy when Trump was elected, an America First foreign policy, because it's uncertain. You cannot predict what Trump will do, so you have to pay a lot of attention to what's going on in Washington, what he will tweet, and things like that. So it's time-consuming. So that's something that was really tough for Trudeau. But again, they can manage the relationship. The other thing that they did that was pretty good is they established links with other elected officials in the states, with governors, senators that are more maybe friendly to Canada. So even though Trump is the president, it's not the end of the world, but it makes the relationship a little more difficult to manage.
Sure. We have a question for you. Recently, a group of 28 Republicans formed the Northern Border Security Caucus. And they've not been so much, they've been focused on the question of the sort of the safety of the border and the permeability of the border and people transiting the border. But for the first time in a long time, the focus hasn't been on, for example, migrants who are looking to move from the United States up to Canada, whether crossing at an irregular border crossing, such as the Roxham Road, or crossing at a regular border crossing. But instead, their focus has been to put a spotlight on individuals who are in Canada who are seeking to illegally enter the United States. And in some ways, it mirrors the focus, I guess you could say, of what's gone on the U.S.-Mexican border, but clearly the numbers are nowhere like the southern border for the United States. But this is the first time we're starting to hear this, and we're hearing it, relatively consistently. What do you sense is at work here? I mean, apart from the politics of this Republican-led Security Caucus, why are they focusing now, do you think, on this notion of individuals trying to enter and illegally and stay in the United States?
Yeah, I saw that too. Few things on that. Well, the Roxham Road deal was in the news, so I guess that it was a good time for them to talk about the northern border. I was also curious to see what would be the reaction in Washington to this deal at Roxham Road, because Biden doesn't want to look soft on borders. He doesn't want Republicans to take advantage of that issue to portray him as a guy who doesn't know what to do on borders come the next election. So it's going to be interesting to see if it was just a one-time thing, or if it becomes more regular to see these kind of discussions in Congress about the northern border. What's the bad news for Canada, I guess, is that, Robert Jervis talked about perceptions and misperception in international relations. These are the kind of discussions that can create, fuel a lot of misperception about the northern border. Just like after September 11, when people were saying in Washington, some people in Washington were saying, some of the terrorists who attack us came through the Canada-U.S. border, and it wasn't the case. But for many years, Canadian representatives in Washington had to fight this kind of misperception. So I don't think it's good news that there are these discussions. I think it could fuel this kind of misperception, and maybe lead some elected officials to argue that more should be done at the border. Maybe a fence, why not? Maybe a wall. We don't know what kind of argument you can end up with when you have these kind of discussions and when they become regular. Right.
One of the inquiries that's just crossed our desk for you to think about, Frederick, is, as you recall, during Pierre Trudeau's turn as Prime Minister, Canada was experiencing a wave in the late 60s and into the early 70s of economic nationalism. And they were profoundly concerned about levels of foreign direct investment by the United States in the Canadian economy. And there were a variety of, seemingly a countless, endless variety of reports and books published on all the dangers associated with that. And the Canadian government announced that they were going to explore and maybe pursue, which I think the best scholarship shows this, there was no active pursuit of this so-called third option, that Canada would try and diversify its economic relationship away from just the United States. Do you sense, we're in 2023 now, do you sense there's any appetite for that in Ottawa, or, is there any kind of conversation arising about that?
There's always conversations about that. Canada looks at Europe, it looks at Asia, of course. And if you look at the province of Quebec, they also have representations all over the world, in East Asia and China, etc. So Canada is always trying to diversify, but it's difficult because of geography. And it's also difficult in this world that I was describing earlier, which is a little more uncertain now that you have China that's rising, you have East Asia, that's a region. It's a region that's less certain than before. You have the war in Ukraine. So all these events are leading Canadian leaders to say, well, we have this friend over the border, and it makes sense to just keep doing business with them at this point of history. But of course, there are discussions about that all the time.
Sure, sure. Now, if you're another observation based on your comments a few moments ago, and that is a question for you from our audience, and that is your presentation suggests that there's at least 3 critical states in the Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, going forward for the next presidential election, obviously, and maybe Georgia as well. While Americans are going to be closely glued to outcomes in those states, Canadians, obviously, given the state and the vibrancy of the Canada-U.S. relationship, will equally be paying attention to those states. From what you know, and from your conversations and interviews with Canadian diplomatic officials and others, how closely does Canada monitor sort of political developments in those states in terms of sort of tracking, besides looking at just public opinion polls, but tracking, possibilities and preparing, sort of, doing their homework ahead of time?
Again, as I said earlier, Trudeau, if you look at public opinion polls in Canada, you see that Trudeau has been more popular before. He was more popular when he entered politics in 2015 than he is today. But I would be curious to look at polls where we ask Canadians, what do you think about the way Trudeau has been managing this relationship with the United States? So do they monitor? I think they do monitor a lot. I don't work in the government. I don't work in Ottawa, but from what I understand, they invest a lot of time and resource to understand what's happening. They have consulates, they have the embassy in Washington. They know their stuff. They follow, of course, the elections when there are elections in the States, not only presidential elections, also midterm elections that can make a huge difference on so many of these issues. So they follow that pretty closely. The province of Quebec also has, again, offices in the U.S. They have people working in Quebec City following what's going on and monitoring the kind of election results that you could get in 2024. So I think they do follow a lot, and particularly these key states, just like we do when there are presidential elections.
Right. A follow-up question with regard to your initial comments today. You made reference to the changes recently at Roxham Road, largely because the newly unveiled changes to the Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement, which effectively now prevents migrants crossing at irregular border crossings, not just at regular border crossings. Someone was interested in asking, sort of why did it take seemingly forever for this agreement to materialize? And I think we know, and please jump in on this, we understand now, we learned earlier this week that this agreement was negotiated about a year ago, and that simply waiting, if you will, not for the opportune time to unveil this, although because there were obviously issues that were emerging over the last few months with a sizable upward tick in people going from the United States to Canada, particularly through Roxham Road. But it was a matter, as folks told us, of making sure that, at least in terms of bureaucratically and in terms of having regulations and having law enforcement and migration folks in place to handle this. Do you care to comment on that, Frederick, please? Did you hear me, Fred?
Yeah, the connection was unstable at the end, but I think I
Sorry.
I got
Yeah.
you. No. It was a fascinating it was fascinating last week because we knew that Biden was coming to Ottawa, and sometimes there are no announcements at all after these meetings. It's just, you shake hands, you say you like each other, and that's pretty much it. You have a joint statement at the end, we're going to work on climate change and blah, blah, blah. But sometimes it remains very vague, very, words and no more. This time was different. And we learned about the deal even before Biden's arrival, Biden's visit, which was even more surprising. And people were very surprised in Quebec City. Also, the provincial government of François Legault had put pressure on Justin Trudeau on this issue, as you all saw in the news. But from what we hear, the province of Quebec didn't know that the deal was coming. They were not informed and blah, blah, blah. And it took a year to make that deal with the Biden administration. There were no leaks of information. It's very, very amazing because usually you can fear that kind of leak. I can't imagine, because there were so many leaks of information when Trump was president, that there could have been leaks like that if Trump was still president. Can you imagine the same kind of negotiation? It takes a year, blah, blah, blah. And then you have a tweet that destroys everything, that destroys the discussion. So it was surprising. It was a big victory for Justin Trudeau. I don't know how they did this in detail, but I know that Mélanie Joly, who is the head of Global Affairs Canada, played a key role in the negotiation. She was able in the last year and close personal contacts with people who matter in Washington. And again, I think they managed this very, very well. Just like they managed the renegotiation of NAFTA very, very well in a very difficult context when Trump was president. So yeah, it was very surprising. Nobody in Canada, I don't think many people in Canada had predicted that this would happen last week.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I've got one last closing question to throw your way, and it's more hypothetical than anything else. We've talked a lot about Canada and the U.S. Let's just change gears for a second and talk about Quebec and the U.S. In the sense that we know Quebec has for years actively solicited and promoted business opportunities for Quebec businesses and for U.S. foreign direct investment in the Quebec economy. How, I guess sort of a two-pronged, how are things going? How does Quebec, now that Joe Biden's been in office for a bit, how has the government of Quebec responded to a new government? And potentially, should Mr. Trump come back into power, how would Quebec City view that? Frederick, did you get my comments?
Again, I'm sorry, it wasn't.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
but I think I got you. You were asking me what Quebec does, and if their approach has changed since the election of Biden. Was that it?
Well, no, just kind of wondering, yeah, how does Quebec feel their approach towards working with the United States now that Biden's been in power for a couple of years, and what would happen if Trump came back?
Mm-hmm. Well, Quebec is trying to take advantage of what the province can bring to the relationship on issues that matter to the Biden administration, but also issues that matter to states that share a border with Quebec in the region, in New England, for instance. So what are these issues? Hydroelectricity, of course. Quebec and Hydro-Quebec want to bring more clean energy to the table because they know that the Biden administration is focusing a lot on clean energy and the green revolution and so on. And the other thing that Quebec does a lot is emphasize economic issues, saying, we know that Biden and others want to create good jobs in the U.S. We want to show what Quebec can bring to the table again. Supply chain management, well, Quebec has critical minerals. What Quebec can also contribute to the friendshoring of supply chain managements in semiconductors. I mentioned the Bromont facility, IBM's facility in Bromont, et cetera, et cetera. But Legault has been focusing a lot on economic issues, critical minerals. There's a strategy about that that was released by the province of Quebec, and also clean energy, of course, because of hydropower. And they have a bunch of offices in the U.S. If you look at what they do on the social media, you'll see that they're pretty active trying to promote what Quebec can bring to the table in North America in this particular context.
Thank you so much. I want to encourage everyone to join me in thanking Frederick for his remarks today. Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry about the connection.
No, and I do want to tell our viewers today, please don't think that the periodic glitches we had with the audio and the video, the freezing, was on your end. Unfortunately, it's on our end, and we're going to make sure that going forward, that's not the case in the future. Thank you, Frederick, for your patience. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy. Amy, please.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you, Dr. Kirky and Dr. Gagnon, for having this very timely conversation on Canada. And special thanks to our virtual audience participants and our supporters at SUNY Plattsburgh, U.S. Department of Education, and the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. We're especially pleased so many SUNY Plattsburgh students, faculty, staff, and alumni joined us. Also, we had some nice representation from the business community as well as government representatives of our North Country region. So thank you for being here. We look forward to being in communication with you all regarding our next conversation on Canada. Meantime, if you're close by to SUNY Plattsburgh, we do want to extend an invitation to you all to join us next Wednesday on April 5th at 4 p.m. to the in-person Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies lecture, featuring Dr. Jean-Philippe Marcoux, Professor of American Literature at University Laval, and the 2023 SUNY Plattsburgh Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Quebec Studies. He will be speaking on the Society of Umbra, Coalition Politics, and Poetics from the Lower East Side to Montreal. So let's stay in touch and enjoy the beautiful spring season that is upon us. Thank you.
Thank you.